Florida is set to execute Polk County killer David Pittman. Barring any last-minute stays, he'll be the 12th execution in Florida so far this year. We were there the day he was arrested. This is video from our archives. Pittman was convicted in the 1990s stabbing his mother and father-in-law and their daughter before setting their Mulberry home on fire.
It was the evening of September 17th, 2025, and inside Florida State Prison, the countdown had reached its end. On the gurney lay David Joseph Pittman, a man convicted of one of the most brutal family murders in Florida's history, the 1990 stabbing deaths of Clarence, Barbara, and their daughter, Bonnie Knowles. But Pittman's execution wasn't just another case on the state's calendar. At 63 years old, he became Florida's 12th execution in a single year, the most in modern state history. Strapped to the table, Pittman used his final breath not for apology, but for defiance. His last words stunned witnesses. "I know you all came to watch an innocent man be murdered by the state of Florida. I am innocent. I didn't kill anybody. That's it." Moments later, at 6:12 p.m., the drugs took hold, and Florida's record-breaking year of executions claimed another life. The final 24 hours of David Pittman had begun. And to understand how it ended, we step minute by minute into the last day of a man who went to his death still insisting he was innocent. The sun had barely begun to set over the quiet fields of Starkey, Florida, when the heavy gates of Florida State Prison locked down tighter than ever. Inside, officers moved with deliberate calm, their eyes fixed on the warrant hour approaching. At the center of it all was David Joseph Pittman, a man whose life had been defined by violence, denial, and decades of appeals. To the state of Florida, he was a convicted murderer, a man who had wiped out 3 members of one family in a single night of rage. The crime dated back to 1990 in the small town of Mulberry. On that night, Clarence and Barbara Knowles and their daughter Bonnie were found brutally stabbed inside their home. The house had been torched in a desperate attempt to erase the evidence, and Bonnie's car was stolen, later found burning on the side of the road. Witnesses told of seeing a man fleeing the flames, and in the weeks that followed, investigators pieced together a case that pointed squarely to Pittman. The motive, prosecutors argued, was as bitter as it was clear. Pittman's marriage to the Knowles daughter had crumbled, and with it came resentment, anger, and threats that turned deadly. In 1991, a jury convicted him on 3 counts of first-degree murder, arson, and theft. By a 9-3 vote, they recommended death. The judge agreed, and Pittman was sentenced to die. For more than 3 decades, he fought that sentence, raising claims of innocence, appeals of intellectual disability, and last-minute motions that stretched into 2025. But as the date on his warrant approached, every legal door slammed shut. Now, with the final appeal denied, Pittman's countdown had begun. As September 16th turned into the early hours of September 17th, 2025, the weight of time pressed hard inside Florida State Prison. In his cell on death watch, David Joseph Pittman was kept under the close eye of guards, every movement recorded, every hour ticking louder than the last. After more than 3 decades of appeals and delays, the man who once thought the courts might save him now had only hours left. Attorneys had filed one final plea, raising claims of intellectual disability, pointing to low test scores and a lifetime of struggles with reading and comprehension. But just before nightfall, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to intervene. The ruling confirmed what many already knew. There would be no reprieve, no stay. Pittman's death warrant would be carried out. Inside his cell, Pittman kept mostly quiet. Guards reported no outbursts, no dramatic gestures, just a steady calm that had replaced years of legal battles. He was allowed a last meal, and according to reports, he asked for a Southern-style plate: steak, fried chicken, and biscuits. But whether from nerves or defiance, he ate little. As the hours slipped away, one visitor was allowed to see him. Conversations were private, sealed behind prison walls, but it was clear that Pittman remained focused on one message: his innocence. Even after 3 decades with witness testimony and evidence laid against him, he never confessed. Outside the prison, protesters held candles and signs, some praying, others calling for an end to the death penalty. But across Polk County, the families of Clarence, Barbara, and Bonnie Knowles braced themselves for justice they had waited more than 30 years to see. Dawn was coming, and with it, the final day of David Joseph Pittman. The morning of September 17, 2025, arrived quietly over Florida State Prison. While much of the state went about its day unaware, inside the walls of Stark, the machinery of death was already in motion. Pittman was woken early, his final routines carried out with the precision of officers who had done this many times before. Every movement was scripted, every step followed with exact detail. Breakfast was offered, but like the night before, Pittman touched little of it. Food had no place in a morning like this. Instead, he remained reserved, his words few, his eyes fixed on the floor or on the guards who moved silently around him. He had lived under sentence of death for 34 years. Now, with only hours left, there was nothing more to fight. Outside, the scene was starkly different. By midday, a crowd had gathered near the prison gates. Some held candles, others carried signs, and a few simply stood in silence, bearing witness to a moment that had been 3 decades in the making. Among them were protesters praying for mercy and abolition, but also supporters of the victims' families who had waited so long to see justice delivered. At the same time, inside the witness list was being finalized. Officials, journalists, and Polk County Sheriff Grady Judd, who had carried the case's memory for years, prepared to take their seats. The chamber, with its gurney and IV lines, had been tested and cleared. Everything was ready. By mid-afternoon, the last appeals had closed, the governor's order was standing, and the clock ticked toward 6. David Pittman, calm but unyielding, would soon walk his final steps. The countdown had entered its final hours. As the clock neared 6 p.m., the doors of Florida's execution chamber opened. Witnesses filed into their seats, the silence heavy with anticipation. On one side sat officials and members of the press. On the other, representatives of law enforcement and loved ones of the Knowles family, waiting for a moment they had been promised for over 3 decades. David Joseph Pittman was led inside, shackled and guided to the gurney. He lay back quietly as officers worked with practiced precision, strapping down his arms, chest, and legs. IV lines were inserted into his veins, running to the lethal injection equipment just feet away. The warden stepped forward, asking the ritual question. Did he have any last words? Pittman's voice broke the silence. Calm but defiant, he looked toward the glass and said, "I know you all came to watch an innocent man be murdered by the state of Florida. I am innocent. I didn't kill anybody. That's it." There were no apologies, no pleas for forgiveness, only the same declaration he had carried for 34 years. Some witnesses shook their heads. Others sat stone-faced. For the families of Clarence, Barbara, and Bonnie Knowles, his words offered no comfort. At 6:06 p.m., the injection began. Pittman drew several deep breaths, his chest rising and falling as the drugs coursed through his body. Within moments, his movements slowed. His head tilted slightly to the side, his breathing shallow, and then finally, still at 6:12 p.m., the physician pronounced him dead. David Joseph Pittman, convicted murderer, 63 years old, and the 12th person executed in Florida in 2025, had met his end, still insisting he was innocent. The official word spread quickly. At 6:12 p.m., David Joseph Pittman was dead. Inside the prison, officials moved swiftly, clearing the chamber and escorting witnesses back outside. But the echoes of his final words, a declaration of innocence, lingered with everyone who heard them. For Sheriff Grady Judd, who had come to watch, there was no question about the outcome. Facing reporters, he called Pittman what he had always believed him to be: evil, a man who wiped out an entire family and never changed. To Judd, and to the prosecution that secured his conviction, the execution was justice, delayed but delivered. Outside the prison gates, the crowd remained split. Protesters held signs reading, "Stop executions," and prayed for the end of capital punishment, their voices steady even as others stood in support of the victims' families. For the Knowles relatives, the execution closed a chapter that had remained open for 35 years, though no sentence could erase the pain of that night in 1990. This execution also marked something larger. Pittman was the 12th person put to death in Florida in 2025, the highest number of executions carried out in a single year in the state's modern history. To some, it was a symbol of strength and law, proof that the death penalty still had a place in Florida. To others, it was a chilling reminder of a system they viewed as broken, fueled by politics rather than mercy. As Pittman's body was prepared for release, his case joined the long list of Florida's capital punishments. He went to his death still insisting he was innocent, a claim that may fade with time, but will never vanish entirely from the story of his final day. What do you think? Should his final words of innocence be remembered as truth, or were they simply the last defiance of a guilty man? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story powerful, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more final hour stories from history's darkest cases.